Hi. So yeah, this video is going to be about a topic that a lot of us probably find outrageous or impossible, and it has to do with how and why we might have compassion for our enemies. Part of the reason I want to explore that phenomenon has to do with the extremely contentious political season we're experiencing in the United States, and also with the more general lines of ideological division that have riven our world these days. However, this topic was inspired a little bit more specifically by a comment on my last video from a viewer who goes by the name Matt Elgin. So, a tip of the invisible chapeau to you, Matt Elgin, wherever in this world you might be. Anyhow, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. As usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. So, perhaps the first question would be, why should we bother having compassion for our enemies in the first place? Wouldn't it be better simply to gratify our desire to harm them and to bludgeon them into submission whenever possible? Well, one response to that question comes to us by way of religion. For instance, from a Christian perspective, Jesus tells us, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despisedly use you and persecute you." That's from Matthew 5:43-44. And okay, love isn't exactly the same as compassion, but I'd say that they are in the same general ballpark. Similarly, within the tradition of Mahayana Buddhism, we find the idea of the bodhisattva, who is a person whose path toward enlightenment involves compassionately assisting all other sentient beings in their own struggles toward enlightenment, irrespective of whether they're friends or enemies. However, perhaps a more immediately compelling reason to have compassion for our enemies has to do with simple practicality. After all, if we never learn to have compassion for our enemies, then all the human race will ever do is move from one needless case of division, subjugation, and death to the next. That's because if history teaches us anything at all, it's that we human beings are endlessly creative and endlessly motivated when it comes to inventing compelling reasons to hate each other. You know, political reasons, religious reasons, ideological reasons, racial and ethnic reasons. You pretty much can name it. And so, if we're never able to break out of that cycle, then we'll probably just stay stuck in the morass of endless stupidity, endless misery, torment, depredation, oppression, and death. Woohoo! And so what's the point here? Maybe we can find a point. Well, the point is that even if it seems a little counterintuitive, we actually have plenty of good reasons to find a way of having compassion for our enemies, both from the perspective of our religious ideals as well as from the perspective of simple secular practicality. Anyhow, at this point we should probably get a handle on what we mean by compassion. So first, I'd like to differentiate compassion from what the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa calls idiot compassion. Basically, idiot compassion is about equating compassion with simply being nice to people. It may look like compassion on the surface, but it's really not. In fact, sometimes being nice to people is the worst thing we can do, especially when doing so perpetuates their already existing problems and pathologies. For instance, being nice to bullies and tyrants, and consequently letting them run roughshod over everyone else, isn't actually compassionate. Certainly not for their victims, and not even for the bullies themselves. Instead, compassion involves doing what we can to help bullies grow out of being bullies. And sometimes that can involve not being nice at all. And sometimes it can even involve violence. But in that case, the difference between compassion and enmity is that compassion involves helping people we hate move forward in life by employing what Buddhists call skillful means, or upaya in Sanskrit. But enmity is about simply gratifying our desires to inflict harm on them, probably mostly as a form of revenge. But of course, in practical terms, making that distinction isn't necessarily an easy thing and can require developing a fair measure of self-awareness, especially with regard to our inner motives for treating people harshly. Okay, so now let's define compassion in more positive terms by turning our attention toward what it is in its own right. And one way of doing that would be to talk a little bit about where we get the word in the first place. Well, the English word compassion comes to us from two Latin roots, a preposition that means with, and a verb that means to suffer. So, the etymological meaning of compassion lies in the experience of suffering with others. But how does that help us? Well, it tells us that to have compassion for people involves truly understanding their suffering. In fact, feeling their suffering in life as a reflection of our own, to be with them in it. In other words, to have compassion is to feel our connection and similarity to other people, to see them as kindred spirits, as our fellow travelers in this world, perhaps different from ourselves in relatively superficial matters, but not so different at the most fundamental levels. Basically, having compassion for our enemies involves being able to perceive how we're actually like them, even if that seems distasteful at first. But of course, seeing ourselves as sharing common ground with our enemies would tend to work against the mechanisms we typically use to justify and perpetuate our enmity. That's because enmity almost always involves trying to maintain a position of moral superiority over the people we despise, especially so that we can feel justified in thinking of them as our enemies in the first place. And justification is important to perpetuating our enmity because if we say to ourselves something like, well, I see X as my enemy, but I don't really have much reason for it, well, it pretty much deflates the emotional force of our hatred. Basically, we hate best when we've convinced ourselves that we have a good reason for it. However, whereas enmity is about wanting to feel hierarchically superior to other people, compassion is about a very non-hierarchical sense of similarity and kinship, much as we described a minute ago. In other words, compassion isn't about feeling superior or inferior to other people, but about sharing the journey of life with them. So then the question becomes, how might we begin to move toward that, especially so that we can gain the spiritual and practical benefits of doing so? And here I'd say that one possible path has to do with learning to forgive our enemies rather than always trying to blame them for our woes. But of course, that's a lot easier to say than to do. Part of that has to do with something I discussed in my last video, the fact that most of us are actually very much attached to our suffering and will do everything in our power not to let go of it. After all, who would we be if we weren't at least partially defined by everything and everyone we hate? However, another related reason why forgiveness is difficult has to do with our egoistic self-importance. And the fact is that it's a lot easier to forgive our enemies for their faults and shortcomings when we have enough self-awareness to recognize our own faults and shortcomings. But of course, most of us don't like to do that, mostly because it tends to bruise our egos, as if forgiving someone has to be an act of self-abnegation rather than a way of enhancing our lives. However, the somewhat surprising reality of forgiveness is that it's actually an incredibly selfish thing, mostly because of the fact that when we truly forgive, which of course is very different from just saying that we forgive, we can then drop the heavy weight of all the resentment we've been carrying inside of ourselves. In other words, at first it seems like forgiveness is a gift we give to other people, a way of letting them off the hook for their moral failings. And maybe at one level it is. But it's really a gift we give to ourselves. As the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once noted, some gifts we receive actually end up taking things from us. And when we forgive other people, we can also receive a strange gift that takes the debilitating weight of our resentments from us. However, despite the fact that forgiveness can easily be a way of enhancing our lives, it does require dropping at least some of our self-importance. And at this point, that may seem like a bit of a contradiction or paradox. That's because most of us think that following the path of our self-importance is the best, most direct route toward a better life, especially by way of gratifying our desires. But in all likelihood, it's not. In fact, our self-importance and our desires can very easily become our prison in this life, the very thing that contains and constricts us the most, and that prevents us from entering into life's deeper possibilities. The reason is that when we think that the whole universe revolves around us, and around whether our desires are gratified or not, it puts us at odds with the fundamental reality of life itself. And that reality is that sometimes life will gratify our desires and sometimes it won't. Basically, whether our desires are gratified or not isn't that important, at least not according to the fundamental logic that governs life. And we're not the center of the universe either. In fact, the universe is incomprehensibly larger than we are. In comparison, we're just tiny grains of sand carried within the infinite ocean of time and space that surrounds us. And if that's not enough, the fact is that every single one of us is also utterly dispensable to the larger order of things, which will become evident for each of us in a very personal and very direct way, especially in the form of our death. Basically, the point is that we're not that essential and we're not that important, at least not as much as we'd like to think. And as a consequence, our tendency to wallow in our self-importance puts us in direct conflict with the larger reality of life. But the main point is that self-importance is another thing that makes it very difficult to have compassion for other people. Mostly because it's very difficult to suffer with other people when we're obsessively preoccupied with ourselves. And of all of the addictive habits to which the human race is heir, self-importance is probably one of the most enduring and intractable. In fact, I'd say that our self-importance pretty much makes black tar heroin look like chamomile tea. But still, if we want to secure the spiritual and practical fruits of learning to have compassion for our enemies, it's important to let go of that addiction and learn the art of forgiveness along the way. However, as is the case with getting past pretty much any addiction, developing self-awareness is an important part of the process. After all, without some appreciable measure of self-awareness, it's difficult even to realize how addicted to self-importance we are in the first place. How it imprisons us and enslaves us and confines our attention to the outermost surface of life, which in turn blinds us to its more luminous depths. Without self-awareness, our self-importance will simply seem like the inescapable reality of life, how things are and how they have to be. Perhaps a little like the prisoners stuck in Plato's cave. But for most of us, self-awareness isn't necessarily an easy thing either, and cultivating it usually takes quite a bit of practice. Personally, I believe that there are many ways of doing that. Religious prayer can be a way, as can creative and aesthetic experience. For me personally, meditation has been invaluable in that regard. But no matter what our way of practicing self-awareness is, it needs to involve cultivating the ability to be quiet and still, especially inside of ourselves. The reason is that as long as our consciousness is filled with the clamor and din of everyday life, we'll always be distracted from the task of developing self-awareness. That's because developing self-awareness involves sculpting away everything that moves us in the exact opposite direction. You know, all of our world's pandemonium and general craziness, much of it disguised as entertainment, especially these days. But of course, that would also involve developing enough backbone to deviate from what pretty much everyone else is doing, to become our own persons rather than clones of the people around us. In other words, it means developing a taste for authentic existence, which for most of us is very much an acquired taste that, like self-awareness, doesn't necessarily come easily. And in turn, acquiring the taste for authentic existence requires some measure of courage, some ability to endure our fears and anxieties, and to move forward into the greater depth of life in spite of them. So, in a way, I'd say that courage is the linchpin for all of this. Not only for learning to exist authentically, but also for developing self-awareness, for learning to forgive, for being willing to enter into a non-hierarchical kinship with other people, and ultimately for learning to have compassion for our enemies. Basically, it takes courage to understand our enemies rather than to judge them. It takes courage to feel their pain as a reflection of our own, and it takes courage to walk with them along the road of life as companions rather than as hardened adversaries. And so probably I should end this video by saying a few things about how to develop courage. And in my experience, the best way is to allow ourselves to do something that feels a little bit dangerous every now and then. Not something stupid, of course, but something that's strategically dangerous. It could be thinking in a certain way, or it could be something more tangible. But the point is to take a chance on life at some point, especially in a way that brings us into contact with the fears that rule us without our even knowing it. Some sort of experience, who knows what it could be, that helps transform our being by beckoning us toward the outer perimeter of who and what we think we are, toward the outermost limits of everything that feels safe and sterile and predictable. You know, the kind of experience that really teaches us something and that shows us that we can survive what alters and changes us, even at the most fundamental levels. Because once we've gone through that sort of thing often enough, once we discover that we can survive what transforms and transfigures our souls, well, then we can develop real courage within ourselves and ultimately let that courage permeate the larger run of our lives. And on that day, well, on that day, maybe having compassion for our enemies won't seem quite so impossible after all. That's because in the final analysis, courage makes a lot of things possible that we once thought were impossible. But, hell, don't take my word for it. Go out into the world and see for yourself. Anyhow, I guess that's the gospel according to Eric for today. Yeah, so anyhow, thanks as always for listening. Thanks as always for watching. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.